let's start with geopolitics. So the U.S. is becoming this enormous player. I wonder if you think that's being overestimated, that suddenly the U.S. is going to be the new Middle East, and we're going to be able to throw our weight around a little bit more geopolitically, or as your own corporate CEO has said, China's going to eventually come on, and there's a lot of shale there, possibly even more reserves than in the United States, and that others will catch up, and this whole geopolitical heft argument kind of moves to the side.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple of thoughts. The place I would start is separating oil and gas, because I think they have different characteristics in terms of the impact. You know, natural gas has come to the point in North America where it's very clear, you know, the pervasiveness of the resources, the tenure of these resources, which will go far, far out into the future, which really can change the way this country and this continent produces and uses energy. That's a real change. So now, if you take that to the point of view of the U.S., even in North America starting to export LNG, then that makes natural gas more available to Europe. It helps with the supply situation in Asia and so forth. That has all those changes that you can imagine that come along with it. I think those are pretty dramatic changes. If we see the type of shale revolution in China that we saw in the U.S., which, you know, for all practical purposes, that probably should happen.
And you're exploring
and we're exploring there now, and the early indications are pretty good. Then I think you can see that domino effect of that really changing the way that portion of energy works. And I'll just tag one thing on to natural gas. If you think about the benefits in terms of it being the cleanest of the fossil fuels from an emissions point of view and so forth, the drivers to use that fuel will continue to increase over the next years and decades as well. So I think that's a reasonably clear picture for gas. Oil, I think, is a lot more complicated. So you asked if the whole situation is being overestimated. I think particularly from North America, the shale oil through fracture trading and so forth, I think that production has a lot more demonstration to do. It's clearly big. I mean, it's likely going to grow to 3 million barrels a day over the next period of time. But it's a very large, very linked global market. Even if we produce a tremendous amount of additional oil ourselves, we're still going to be linked to the global oil market. We're still going to care what happens in the Middle East. If not as much, or to the degree of imports for ourselves, we're going to care about what happens to the other countries that are dependent on that oil. China will become more dependent on that oil, most likely. So I think the interaction, the need to be tied to those geopolitical factors won't be a lot less strong than it is today.
Yeah. So when you said that oil has more proving to do, what do you mean by that?
Well, I just think it's earlier in the resource development. So if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I wouldn't have been as confident about where we are with natural gas as I am today.
Right.
Because these vast resources that we've all talked so much about, you actually have to drill these wells and you have to produce these resources for a number of years before you know what it's going to do over the next 20 or 30 years. Mm-hmm. So now we're making projections that say the U.S. has 100 years of supply of natural gas. And you can back that up with technology and scientific measurements and so forth. We're just not quite there yet on the oil side because we have a lot more work to do. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and let me add one more piece, John, because I think the other thing about oil that makes it more complicated is, oil has to be turned into something more usable, and that's more difficult to do than with natural gas. So it takes that refining capacity and so forth. There's, untold billions of dollars that have been put into infrastructure for refining and modifying those oil resources to usable products in the U.S., and that doesn't shift very quickly.
Yes.
But the oil that's being produced now is light oil. There's a lot of that infrastructure that's not geared towards light oil. And I think the other dynamic that's going to be controversial, but it's going to be a big part of this story over the next decade or two, is do we continue to import the type of oil we need, and do we now actually export some of the oil that we have, but we don't have the facilities and the infrastructure to modify it the way we need to?